It was just a random thing I saw on the internet that was funny. Some body cam footage of some cops that had gotten called to somebody's house, and this guy got 911 called on him because his neighbor saw him building a guillotine in the backyard, and the cops showed up, and they were like, "This is the body cam footage," and they were like, "So you're not planning on like killing anybody with it?" He was like, "No, it's just fun, whatever." And they're like, "Can we see it?" And he took him back and showed him how it worked and everything. And the cops were like, "That's awesome, man."
What the hell does that even mean?
What you getting at with the book script? Spit that shit out, man!
When I was you.
That goose-stepping morons like yourself should try reading books instead of bad.
All right, welcome back to Propaganda Loves You Book Club, where we are on episode 3 of a read-through and review of Minority Rule, the Right-Wing Attack on the Will of the People and the Fight to Resist It. So just a quick recap. I think, the first episode we talked about a lot of the history and that Ari Berman laid out as far as some of the different institutional controls that were put in place at the beginning of the framing of the Constitution that enabled minority rule. We talked a lot about in the last episode, I think, like what occurred in the 2018 Georgia election, and like it was a flash forward to how those institutions can be co-opted and used in anti-democratic means. And so for this week, we've got 3 chapters we're going to cover: the institutional coup, the electoral coup, and the insurrection through other means, chapters 7, 8, and 9. But there's 2 things that I wanted to talk about specifically that have happened since our last that are directly relevant to this book that we're reading. So last Tuesday, the Supreme Court upheld the 14th Amendment. There was a challenge to birthright citizenship, and they upheld it 6-3, which, while it's great that it's upheld, it's not great that it's a 6-3 decision. And, it seems like pretty clear writing. It's been challenged multiple times before, and it's been basically stopped on each one of those challenges to the 14th Amendment. We'll talk about that a little bit in the book today. So that's something that we need to, or I would say, if you want to know why like the 6-3 ruling is not a good thing, I mean, first, right, it's pretty clear in how the 14th Amendment was written, like all people, right? Specifically, it was created to undo Dred Scott and that ruling that was basically ruling that said Black Americans could never be citizens, right? So it's pretty clear in the writing of that. But I would say definitely take a look there. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was the 17th Amendment. So this isn't necessarily that the Supreme Court ruled on this, but I think we've talked about it before on the show, especially with this book, that, we, the citizens of the United States, did not directly elect senators for 125 years. And so Representative Keith Self, the Freedom Caucus, who is part of the Freedom Caucus from Texas, introduced a joint resolution on June 25th to repeal the 17th Amendment and return Senate elections to state legislatures. Has 9 co-sponsors from the Republican Party. And this is actually related to the SAVE Act, the fact that the Senate won't pass the SAVE Act. So his response to the Senate blocking voter registration restriction bill is to propose stripping Americans of the right to elect senators. So the logic here is if the Republicans control the House and they're the ones that determine the Senate, that locks in control of the Senate for the Republicans, and then they could pass whatever bill they wanted to here. Anyway, just two examples that have come out recently of additional, attempts to weaken democracy and push more people off of the ballot, or the ability to actually cast a ballot in the United States. And that gets into kind of the next couple chapters here that we have. So starting with chapter 7, I think I'll give kind of like a quick view here of what my big takeaways were, but the institutional coup was really talking about what occurred with the Republican Party when they were in control of the White House and the executive branch under Trump the first time, and their attempts to interfere with the 2020 census. So it really talked a lot about the attempts to add a citizenship question to the census with the intent of eventually move to only legal citizens would be the ones that would receive representation. So what I wanted to start with was that we're going to actually revisit Kobach here. And what I want to start with is actually their argument that they kind of put forward here. So I'm going to start reading from page 146 This is the last paragraph there, but I'm going to read this and a bit of the next pages here. So, Kobach wrote to Ross in July 2017 that the absence of a citizenship question leads to the problem that aliens who do not actually reside in the United States are still counted for congressional apportionment purposes. As he further explained in a column for Breitbart News, a person whose very presence in the United States is illegal and who may return home or be deported at any time cannot be considered a resident of the district in any meaningful sense. Kobach's plan would have redefined the very nature of how representation was determined in the United States dating back to the country's founding. Fair representation had been one of the core principles of the new republic. No taxation without representation was a leading rallying cry of the revolution, which was followed in Great Britain by a revolt against the rotten boroughs of the British Parliament, where absentee lords representing as few as a dozen people received more seats than growing industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham. Though most of the newly formed states denied the vote to women, black people, and propertyless white people, the leading founders believed everyone was entitled to political representation, even if the institutions they created often fell short of democratic ideals. There can be no truer principle than this. Every individual in the community at large has an equal right to the protection of the government, Hamilton said at the Constitutional Convention. So that part's just interesting to me. Like, this is clearly a debate that's been, from the framing of the Constitution, and one that, I think we look back through a lot of these loopholes that were put in, or areas that were anti-democratic, and we're looking basically at kind of like losses for progressives. But this is one where I would think that they won the rhetorical war or the wording, right? Maybe not initially, but certainly in the 14th Amendment. So, continuing to read here, when the post-Civil War slate of constitutional amendments was being debated in 1865 and 1866, some radical Republicans, led by Representative Thaddeus Stevens, proposed apportioning House seats based on legal voters instead of total population. They predicted correctly that newly emancipated African Americans would be disenfranchised, yet still counted by former slave states seeking to grab even more power than they had under the 3/5 clause. But other pro-Reconstruction Republicans argued that despite this prediction, non-voters such as women and children were entitled to representation even if they could not vote. No one will deny that population is the true basis of representation, for women, children, and other non-voting classes may have as vital an interest in the legislation of our country as those who can actually deposit the ballot, said the Representative James Blaine of Maine. In the end, the 14th Amendment stated, representatives shall be appointed counting the whole number of persons in each state. That settled the issue at the federal level for a while, until immigration surged at the turn of the 20th century, and the census became a political battleground at the time of rising nativism and demographic tension. I'm going to skip the next couple sentences here, but it's basically just talking about how between 1905 and 1914, millions and millions of more immigrants were entering the United States. It was like one of the highest periods in the country. So due to this rising influx of immigration, I'm going to read this now. Albert Johnson, this is second paragraph from the bottom. Albert Johnson, the Republican chair of House Immigration Committee, introduced a new law in 1924 to institute strict quotas on immigration from everywhere but Northwest Europe. It capped immigration at 1/10 of current levels and limited arrivals from any country to 2% of its foreign-born population in the United States, basing these numbers not on the 1920 census, but from 1890, before most immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe had arrived. It is hoped to guarantee, as best we can at this late date, racial homogeneity in the United States, Johnson said. Johnson's bill passed with ease, 308 to 62 in the House, 69 to 9 in the Senate, supported by large majorities of both parties. America must be kept American, said President Calvin Coolidge, who signed the law in May 1924. America of the melting pot comes to an end, read a full-page New York Times editorial by Senator David Reed of Pennsylvania, who sponsored the bill with Johnson. It showed two maps, one with the current levels of immigration, the other with the new plan. In the second map, much of the immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe simply disappeared. The racial composition of America at the present time thus is made permanent, Reed wrote. The law worked with precision. Immigration fell from 1.2 million in 1914 to just 150,000 by the end of the 1920s, and nearly 90% of visas went to Northwest Europe instead of Southern and Eastern Europe, a complete reversal from earlier in the decade. The law established the country's first numerical limits on immigration and a clear racial and ethnic hierarchy. A year after its passage, Adolf Hitler cited America as the one state in which one can observe at least weak beginnings of a better conception of citizenship. The Nazi handbook would cite Johnson Reed as a model for Germany. It was America, Hitler said it a year before becoming chancellor, that taught us a nation should not open its doors equally to all nations. And so I wanted to read that. That was a bit of a longer section there, but I wanted to read that one because it talks about how this has been an argument since the framing of the Constitution during the Constitutional Convention. This is not a new argument, but it also shows the different ways at which this has worked or not worked. So like the whole, hey, we can't change the 14th Amendment or the definition, so what we're going to do is we're just going to put a cap on immigration, right? Like, so like effectively getting the same result that they were looking for without actually changing the Constitution. So anyway, yeah, I wanted to kind of read through that. Any thoughts on that section there? Anything?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to chew on here, so not sure where to start really, but the idea of personhood comes to mind, of like the difference between humanity and personhood. Personhood is like a political conception. It's who a government counts as a legitimate, I almost made a joke about this when you started reading, because you said, the Kobach quote said, leads to the problem that aliens who do not actually reside in the United States, etc. I was like, I didn't know we had aliens already. I didn't know we made contact. What was he talking about? He's talking about human beings who he does not consider persons. It's a political distinction. And this whole idea of who gets to vote, who's represented by the vote, it can start to sound really complicated. And I always just felt like I didn't understand it. Like it was over my head. It was too, conceptually dense for me to wrap my head around. But that's part of the strategy, is to make it seem really complicated and complex. Democracy is consent of the governed. So if a government wants to have authority over a group of people, all of the people they claim authority over are the people they need to consent from to have legitimate authority. And so when you define it that way, like who are they claiming authority over? It's all the human beings in these lines on this map. Not just the ones who immigrated legally, not just the ones who look the way you want them to look, or who have property or whatever. It's all human beings. Not to mention plants and animals and wildlife and watersheds and all that stuff, but that's a separate conversation. So yeah, it's insidious and insane to see the lengths to which power-hungry people will go to limit the availability for people to participate in the democratic process. If you're a human being, you should get to vote. And if you say, no, not those people, not these people, you should make an extremely strong, robust case for why you want to exclude some human beings from the right to choose their representatives.
Or even at like the lesser level of be represented, be counted as a person in where you're living and paying taxes, right? Like, yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, I thought it's just the exact same methods, just the gloves were kind of off at the time. They're just showing like, no, let's just cap the issue. And now that like, they identify this issue of like, white people becoming a minority, they're trying to just stifle it even more. Yeah, I think exactly like this institutional coup is about the bureaucratic, like procedurals, like they're naming it something complicated, like what you're saying, Joe, but like really it's pretty obvious what the plan is. And they're just trying to make it overly complicated. I loved the Hitler quote at the end, which shows like immigration is just a mistake. And great. So that's Hitler's take. And let's do the opposite.
Well, it's like we've influenced Hitler and Goebbels. So I didn't know that was a Hitler quote. Like I just reading this was when I saw that. But yeah, that's great. We're really influential on Nazi Germany for some reason. That's a strange feeling to have, right?
Yeah, the World War II propaganda is weird. Like Nazi Germany and the U.S. were low-key buddies. Like they traded notes, and like the Nazis were big fans of the slave system the U.S. had in the 19th century. Like they were very inspired by U.S. history, and it's important for people to reckon with that and recognize that this whole propaganda of U.S. government always being the good guys doesn't historically stack up, and we really have to be able to see that and talk about it.
Agreed. I also thought like this section here, when I was reading through this, it made me think more about what's occurring right now with Trump basically saying, no immigration from certain countries, but let's get more of the, Northern Europeans or white South Africans can apply for asylum here, right? So it's, how do we, I mean, it's all the same thing, right? Like try to get rid of people from the country that you don't want here and then bring in people that you think are going to meld with you culturally for some reason. I don't know. I don't know. Like, just because they're white. I mean, white people have hated white people for a long time. If you go back, go look at England. There's plenty of white on white violence in a ethnically homogenous area, if you want to call it that. And Arthur, you talk about this was, it's showing how you can take some of the more boring bureaucratic parts of the system that people probably don't think about most of the time, like the census. People, I don't know. I don't think about the census a lot, but it was clearly something that the framers of the Constitution thought was extremely important. If they pushed, I think it talked about like sending people out to complete the census and the original time they did it and whatnot. They thought it was really important to have an accurate counting of everybody. And then how, I think, is this in this chapter when they basically used, the Voting Rights Act, like they're saying that the question of adding, is this person a U.S. citizen, like would help with enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. So the thing that was supposed to expand voting rights for everybody, they're just using that as a like blatant propaganda, like, oh no, this is for this thing, when it's clearly an anti-democratic use that they're trying to go for here.
So funny. I was thinking about that too with the naming of the committee that did the Shelby County thing, and I was trying to find it because it was the exact same. It's like, here's Project of Fair Representation. It's like, okay.
Yeah.
Nope, it's conservative, and they're actually the exact opposite.
Fair means white representation.
Exactly. Oh, nice.
I just think that those three categories of domination, those elementary forms of domination that we learned about in the dawn of everything, can apply to everything. Like you're either using your charisma to influence people, you're controlling information, which is bureaucracy and what they're doing with manipulating the census, or you're using violence. You're cracking down using the police and the military. And it's always one of these three methods. No, trust this guy. Look how smart and handsome and well-spoken he is. Trust him. Don't worry about it. No, don't worry. It's too complicated. You can't figure it out. It's messy. We got experts. Elon knows computers. We're going to figure out all that complicated stuff. Oh, no. We got guns. We'll fucking shoot you if you don't do what we say. Like, it's always one of those three things. They don't ever really want to trust people with all that stuff. I don't know. I just think those three categories are always really, I don't know. It's hard to find something that's going on that doesn't fit into that schema. It's a good little schema.
Yeah. One thing I didn't hit on here was also when we're talking about the taking over the post office with Louis DeJoy, who was a GOP mega donor. So let me just read this because that'll be better here. At the same time, Trump pushed to exclude immigrant communities from political representation. He railed against the expansion of voting by mail during the COVID-19 pandemic, accusing Democrats of using COVID to steal an election. That spring, the U.S. Postal Service's Board of Governors, under heavy lobbying from the administration, had overlooked more qualified candidates and installed a Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, a GOP megadonor who had donated $2.5 million to the party since 2016 and served as the finance chairman for the Republican National Convention. In record time, DeJoy, who ran a logistics company in North Carolina, instituted a dizzying array of changes, eliminating overtime, reassigning 23 top executives, reducing post office hours that led to major mail delays. These moves seem designed to further both the GOP's long-term goal of privatizing the post office and its short-term goal of suppressing mail-in votes cast disproportionately by Democrats during the pandemic. So, again, institutional coup. Take over the bureaucratic institutions that decide how people get representation, also take over the institutions like the post office that help people vote and make that more accessible to others and make it work less well. Basically break it so that you can say, hey, this thing doesn't work. We should put it in the hands of businessmen, ignoring the fact that it was a businessman that was in charge of it when it broke. So to close out this chapter, I'm going to read from page 167 and just hit this here. So What they were so concerned about, again, with the census was that they would show the white share of the country is falling. And so the release of the census count in August 2021 showed exactly what the Trump administration had been so afraid of. The white share of the country had fallen to 57.8%, the lowest in U.S. history, with the white population declining for the first time on record since 1790. The country was more diverse than ever before. Of the 23 million new residents counted over the past decade, all the growth had come from people who identified as Hispanic, Asian, Black, or more than one race. Our analysis of the 2020 census results showed that the U.S. population is much more multiracial and more racially and ethnically diverse than we had measured in the past, said Nicholas Jones, the director of race and ethnic research in the Census Bureau's population division. Georgia was on the verge of becoming a majority-minority state 6 years earlier than expected, and whites had become the minority in 6 new metropolitan areas: Atlanta, Austin, Dallas-Fort Worth, New Orleans, Orlando, and Sacramento. Similarly, the white population decreased in Wisconsin, but nearly all of the state's growth came from communities of color. 60% of U.S. residents lived in the 539 counties that voted for Biden, which accounted for 65% of the country's population growth over the past decade. Huge swaths of rural America lost population while urban areas boomed. This diversity explosion, as Brookings Institution demographer William Frey called it, was exactly what the likes of Kobach, Bannon, and Eastman have been trying to stop. Yet 7 months later, when the Bureau released a deeper analysis of the count, it became clear Trump's efforts to sabotage the census had at least partially succeeded. The 2020 census failed to count 18.8 million people, more than twice the size of New York City, the largest undercount in 3 decades. Blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans were all missed at higher rates than the 2010 census, while the white residents were overcounted at double the rate. The repeated attempts to obtain citizenship information had indeed skewed the final count. The Latino undercount tripled in 2020 from 2010, depriving these communities of critical economic and political resources for the next decade. Mark Morial of the National Urban League called it population suppression. Today we learned that the 2020 census was a 5-alarm fire, said Naleos Arturo Vargas. By that time, the key figures who led the fight to undermine one of the institutional pillars of American democracy had moved on to an even more frightening effort to overthrow the country's electoral system. At least partially successful at suppressing the outcome that they didn't want by putting a question that people were afraid to answer and avoided. So there we go.
Love how American government always seems like 4 businessmen in a trench coat stacked up trying to pretend to be a government, just manipulating stuff. Like, I don't know, all the shenanigans that goes on. There's always some billionaire trying to mess with stuff. I was thinking about what's the guy's name? Is it Wilbur Ross? Yeah. Got his first name. That's the guy who's like pushing for the question on the census. It's all this drama starts because some billionaire has an idea and he just keeps emailing the person and they don't respond. He's like, I'm going to go to your manager if you don't respond. Like the kind of access they get to government, the kind of influence they get, it's just so skewed and weird and unfair.
Yeah. And he, pushed to have that. And I think he was the one that was saying it would be to better enforce, right? The Voting Rights Act. He was like, it'll be
that whole thing.
Which the Supreme Court did rule against, I think 5-4, which is also, it's just like 5-4. Oh God, yeah. It's basically impossible to win up there, which I think is the point. We figured that out in the last one we talked about. So, all right, next chapter, the Electoral Coup. So I mean, this chapter really covers what happened to buy, or what did Trump do when the institutional coup didn't work. Right. So you weren't able to do what you needed to on the institution side when you controlled them to win the election. So what do you do next? Well, you try to say the election was stolen and throw out votes. So this was my takeaway, was the big story of this chapter, was talking through how, it detailed more about how Trump actually reached out to Georgia officials. It was the phone call saying, hey, get rid of a certain amount of votes. How, John Eastman basically came up with this theory, right, of what they could do to change the outcome, which was the fake electors theory, or the alternate electors theory. I don't know what you want to call it. Fake electors is probably the better one. But basically that Pence could come back and say, that there was issues with the vote, send it back to the states, and then they could set up a new round of electors, which would somehow vote for Donald Trump instead of, Joe Biden. So it was, I don't know, the most blatant example of trying to change the outcome of an election that I think we saw like directly after it happened, after the votes had been counted, and trying to basically wipe out the vote completely in that scenario for those specific states.
Before the chapter, I didn't know about the whole coup memo thing being so large. Like, I thought it was one state or something. It was like several states where they did the electorate scam.
Yeah.
Was it 7 states? Is that right?
I can't remember how many states, but it was like, I think it was pretty much all of the swing states that they tried, or specific cities within the swing states that they tried to go after. I mean, obviously the big one was
Yeah,
Georgia.
I just thought, yeah, totally. Like, I had the same thought you had, which was like, it was just kind of the most blatant, like, mask off since Bush v. Gore or something. It's just like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It was very telling. And I can't believe that they like publicized some of this stuff. Like, how do these phone calls become public record? And why is Pence saying no? I don't know. It's just interesting. It's like a lot of in-group fighting in the MAGA Trump, regime.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah, they weren't 100% on the same page that first time. Like, he just didn't have quite the... And then he's just gotten rid of everybody at this point that disagreed with him for the most part. I just think, like, you're talking about the infighting that was going on, especially the Georgia Republican Party, because I think this is on page 184. I'll just read through this. The Georgia Republican Party, meanwhile, was in a full-scale civil war. Trump began attacking Brian Kemp, who is one of his closest allies, in 2018, when the governor employed a series of voter suppression tactics against Abrams, which we talked about in the last episode, almost immediately after the election for refusing to overturn the results, which the governor almost apologetically said he didn't have the power to do. The governor's done nothing, Trump told Fox News. He's done absolutely nothing. I'm ashamed that I endorsed him. He denounced Kemp on Twitter as the hapless governor of Georgia. Georgia's 2 GOP senators, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, called on Secretary of State Raffensperger, who oversaw the count, to resign, and they backed the Texas lawsuit that sought to throw out the state's electoral votes. Just worth re-mentioning. So this was Texas that was suing Georgia to throw out Georgia's electoral votes, and both of Georgia's senators agreed with Texas that they should do that, and that the GOP state representative Raffensperger should resign. Like, yeah, it was complete chaos. and it's because they knew they were right. Like, they knew their election results were good, and they didn't want to, bend to this obvious, complete takeover attempt. So
that's a pretty funny argument. It's like classic GOP, where it's just like, well, we say it's right. Look who's saying it. It's us in Texas.
Right.
Okay.
And then, like, thank goodness they didn't. I don't know what would have happened if they had done that. Like, well, I don't know, maybe it would have short-circuited this whole thing. We wouldn't be where we are right now. But the thing that sucks is, like, it goes right back into the next chapter of institutional coup, even if you didn't do it by overtly changing the results of election. But, okay, now we know what institutional things we need to change to make sure we get the outcome we want. So, but before we get into that one, I do have about a page and a half I want to read here that starts on 185. And so this is going to talk a little bit about January 6th and what occurred there. So January 6th, 2021 was only the third day in Congress for Nikema Williams, but it was shaping up to be a busy one. She slept just 2 hours the night before, celebrating Warnock's win and doing countless media interviews. I did forget that the runoff was literally the day before the insurrection occurred. But now she was preparing to give her first speech on the floor of the House of Representatives. Republican members of Georgia's congressional delegation were planning to challenge the certification of the state's electoral college votes when Congress officially counted them, just days after Trump demanded it. In a phone call with Raffensperger that he said fined 11,780 votes to reverse Biden's victory. Williams was slated to rebut them. She wore blue for the occasion. As one of the electors, this was personal for Williams. She was raised by her grandparents in rural Alabama in a home with no indoor plumbing or running water. Her great-aunt, Authrine Lucy, had been the first black student to attend University of Alabama in 1956, where she was expelled after 3 weeks following white riots. The man she had replaced in Congress, John Lewis, had been brutally beaten while marching for voting rights in Selma, Alabama. Williams planned to argue that the challenge to certifying Biden's victory in Georgia was the latest in a long line of voter suppression tactics targeting black voters in the South. I'll be ready to defend our democracy and stand there in honor of Congressman Lewis, she said, and fight to protect the vote of everyone who turned out and cast a vote in this historic election cycle. She arrived at the Capitol complex early, figuring the heavily guarded area was the safest place for her to be. Ossoff's race was yet to be called, but the numbers looked promising. Another new member of her class, Representative Sarah Jacobs of California, was planning to bring champagne over to her office for a toast. They started looking for cups, then they received a text alert that their building was on lockdown. At 11 a.m., John Eastman took the stage at the Save America rally at the Ellipse, a large oval park south of the White House. Standing next to Rudy Giuliani, he wore a floppy brown hat, camel overcoat, and a red paisley scarf, looking every bit the Batman villain, wrote the Los Angeles Times. Giuliani said that Eastman, the professor, was there to explain how the Democrats cheated in the Georgia runoff and how it was exactly the same as what they did on November 3rd. The conspiracy theories about the election had only escalated since Eastman had testified before Congress legislature a month earlier. The old way of voter fraud, he told tens of thousands of Trump supporters who had gathered near the National Mall, was to have a bunch of ballots sitting in a box under the floor, and when you needed more, you pulled them out in the dark of the night. Now, he alleged, they put those ballots in a secret folder in the machines, sitting there, waiting until they know how many they need. Giuliani flashed a thumbs up. Eastman had spent January 4th meeting with Vice President Mike Pence in the Oval Office, urging him to reject the state-level certifications of Electoral College votes for Biden when he presided over the Senate, which had never been done before in U.S. history. He had drafted a 6-page memo outlining how Pence could unilaterally reject the votes or send them back to GOP-controlled legislatures to reverse the outcome. Pence and his aides said they had no power to do this, citing the ceremonial role of the vice president when Congress counted the results. A federal judge would later call Eastman's actions a coup in search of a legal theory. All we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the states look into this so we can get to the bottom of it, and the American people know whether we have control of our government or not, Eastman said to loud cheers. Giuliani clapped and nodded approval. Eastman became more animated as he spoke. We no longer live in a self-governing republic if we can't get the answer to this question, he said, banging his fist on the lectern. Anybody that is not willing to do it does not deserve to be in office. Giuliani pumped his fist. God bless you, he said to Eastman as Eastman exited the stage. Trump took the podium next, urging his supporters to march to the U.S. Capitol. You'll never take back your country with weakness, he said. So if you can't rig the system enough, then just try and throw out the results and implement your own.
Terrifying. It comes down to Pence, and they use all these arguments, and like, we're lucky that Pence is the minimum threshold of a public official, that he's not willing to incite a coup. That's like terrifying. And now they've learned it and they've replaced people.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Didn't stop.
And it's like this I can see this like whiny little 1%er like argument of like, haha, we did it. We went through all your procedural things and it's like, good luck with the guillotine.
Not a lot of procedural things there.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about how much damage they're doing to trust and to like general trust in elections, right? Like the more they do shit like this, the less people trust the electoral system in general. And then I don't know if it's intentional on their part or if it's a mistake or if it's both, because like we were talking about in the previous chapter with the post office, like how they'll bring a businessman in to break it on purpose and be like, look, it's broken, give it to the businesses. So if this is the same strategy with the elections, it's kind of like, I don't know, I'm thinking of like how those ominous things Trump had said before the 2024 thing, like just do it this one more time and you'll never have to vote again. Like, what is they have a plan of some sort, I'm sure, but what is their plan when there's absolutely no trust in the electoral system? And they know that. It's scary times.
I think the plan is exactly what you're saying. It's create an environment where there is no trust in the electoral system, where there's no trust in federal government or longstanding institutions, in order to manufacture consent from the public enough to tear them down, or to the point where when they do tear them down, they're not going to get an immediate uprising around these things. Like, so if we think about 2016 or Obama, I don't know, I'm just trying to think, like, if they tried to implement the Save America Act or do hardly any of the things they're doing before Trump, like, would it have worked or would it have caused like a massive backlash? Like, have they pushed everything enough so far to the right to where they're basically enabling their follow-on actions, I guess?
Yeah, I guess the other thing I'm thinking about with this too is like the percentage of the population they're addressing with all the electoral manipulation and stuff is still such a fraction. Like they're not accounting for the massively unrepresented portion of the country that doesn't participate in elections that already, like, I don't know, they might get the registered voter class to, I don't know, go along with whatever their plan is when general trust in the electoral system fails. I don't think people are just going to roll over, go along with it. I'm kind of echoing Arthur's warning about the guillotine, I guess.
There's like way more than one, right? One per block. No, I totally agree with you. And I read some article like a week ago about this exact thing that we're talking about, where like, the voting block is like, let's say it's like 20% of, the population, and it's like, 60% or 40%, something like that, does not vote at all. And it's actually, if you can just get those people, like, you kind of win. But I think that's the whole GOP play, is to make people hate the elections, to stay out of it, and to create apathy towards it altogether. And then, it's like they take the 3% that voted for them, they register it, and they go, we win. And they're not prepared for the populist movement that awaits them.
So jumping into the last chapter we're going to cover for today, Insurrection Through Other Means. If the first two chapters that we talked about were, while Trump and his allies were still in power, what they tried to do with the census and with the post office in order to influence the election. After they lost the election, the next chapter is what they tried to do to reverse the outcome of the election and steal back the electoral coup. And when that didn't work and the Jan 6 insurrection, did not work, that gets us to, okay, what do they do next, right? And so my big takeaway from chapter 9, Insurrection Through Other Means, was that the groups that were really pushing for a, minority rule in the country, right, did not stop. And that after winning the election, Biden and his team, for some reason, did not take that threat seriously, or were so idealistic that they thought if they could get popular legislation passed, that would be some sort of bulwark against this type of action. And so this chapter was one that was, I don't know, really frustrating for me to read, especially because it just felt like so many opportunities for Biden's team to do more, and they chose not to. Like, they just did. It almost seemed like they just really didn't realize the moment that they were in, where they were so focused on like the priorities that they were trying to do that, they didn't think about, ways that they could actually protect democracy. I mean, I think the cynical view on it is maybe they didn't want to. I don't know, like, if that's a legit view of it or not, but that was probably the most frustrating read for me, was just realizing how little it kind of, to me, harkened back to, or felt similar to, like, the failure of their disinformation organization, like trying to stand that up and then immediately folding, or just not putting pressure on it, not realizing how important those things actually are, and putting some sort of teeth behind it. But then the other thing that was interesting to me about this chapter was how it talked a lot about heritage action. I think we've talked about the Heritage Foundation before, but heritage action and how they went after certain senators to try and influence, legislation. So I've got a couple areas that I could read here, but before I do, anything from you guys that you took away that maybe I didn't, or anything you wanted to read?
Yeah, I guess I just found it, like, same as you, pretty frustrating to read. It just read as like a litmus test of like how to take over the officials who are actually signing off on the electoral ballots or whatever, and actually certifying them. And now these people are like be put in charge, and some of them served in the 2024, like, to actually sign the official things because they won. And some people are like down ballot in one local elections. It's kind of like they're like waiting in the weeds. And I don't know. It just made me want like a big database of the Republicans and like track how they're voting and kind of like a ballotpedia thing, but more clear and just like see where they end up so that in 20 years, if you're voting for him, like, hey, this guy 25 years ago actually denied deal. Like I'd love to know that. So I hope people are keeping track. Yeah.
The only thought I have is more of a general thought, something for us that we've already talked about and that we'll probably talk about many times again. But just a thing that we come back to is this disappointment in Democratic administrations that have opportunities to do real positive legislative things, and then they just fumble and we end up being disappointed. I think of the Clinton administration in the 90s. They passed a crime bill, but they didn't get health care through, even though that was a priority. Obama administration with the bailouts for the big businesses. But again, the sort of disappointment of the Affordable Care Act. And then whatever Biden's administration was, which was a big disappointment in a lot of ways. So this is, for those of us on the left who end up having to vote for Democratic candidates in presidential elections, a constant conversation we're having to have with ourselves is why do they drop the ball? And what do we do about it? So I just kind of wanted to flag that as like a meta conversational thing that we probably need to come back to a bunch of times.
I think this was in our earlier episode this week, but from that article that you read, the quote that I called out, that's why I like that quote so much, because we're talking about like how do you still influence? They pray another progressive, but we should still rally behind them and use our power base to push for progressive policies wherever we can. So building that power base that eventually influences, or hopefully influences, the Democrat. I think we've seen a lot of that with what's going on with the DSA in New York State. I know we haven't talked about that too much, but that was another big thing that came out of election night, was DSA reps winning a lot of spots in New York City, Mamdani-backed candidates. So I think it is the shift of, you start with, I guess, voting for whoever closest aligns, but try to get your coalition. There we go. Coalition.
Yeah. No, what I heard you say in there, and it kind of clicked for me, is it doesn't matter so much why these administrations have disappointed us, like whatever the causes and conditions were, but going forward, the power base of everyday working people that are organized around specific policies need to have more influence over the administration than the ruling class. And so far that hasn't happened. The ruling class always, even over Democratic administrations, obviously over Republican ones, but even Democratic ones, the ruling class has much more influence that it exerts over those administrations than the people do. And until we flip that, there's not much that we can do about it. We should just expect to be disappointed until we get organized.
Yeah. Until we need to be as or more annoying than whatever corporate person is calling. All right, so I want to read from just a section really quick. So, we talked in the last episode about the 2018 election in Georgia. This goes in, and what's, we talked about the institutional coup, the electoral coup, and how Georgia really pushed back a ton on Trump trying to, make the electoral coup happen. But then we, find out just one election later, or not even one election later, but that Georgia's going to be implementing a ton of the essentially voter disenfranchising laws that would ensure GOP had a better chance of winning. So despite, refusing to completely outright flip the Electoral College in the past and, moving forward, the legislature has no problem passing bills that would actually make it harder for people to vote. So on page 198, this starts, second paragraph, on March 23rd, 2021, 3 days before the Georgia legislature would pass a sweeping bill rolling back access to the ballot, Jessica Anderson, the executive director of Heritage Action for America, met with Brian Kemp to urge him to quickly sign the legislation when it reached his desk. She was a 35-year-old former Trump administration official in the Office of Management and Budget with long blonde hair and an attack dog personality. I had one message for him. Anderson, who led the sister organization to Heritage Foundation, one of the country's most influential conservative think tanks, recounted to top donors during an exclusive retreat in Tucson, Arizona, a month later. Do not wait to sign this bill. If you wait even an hour, you will look weak. This bill needs to be signed immediately. Kemp followed Anderson's advice, announcing the signing of the Election Integrity Act an hour after its passage from his office in the state capitol. Though Kemp had resisted Trump's attempt to overturn the election by certifying the 2020 results, he eagerly embraced the effort to rewrite Georgia's voting laws in the months that followed. There's no doubt that there were many alarming issues with how the election was handled, the governor said, echoing the disinformation spread by Trump. And these problems, understandably, led to the crisis of confidence at the ballot box here in Georgia. Nearly 6 minutes in, he abruptly stopped his speech. "What's the problem?" he asked an aide. Park Cannon, a young black Democratic state representative who represented a historic section of downtown Atlanta that included Ebenezer Baptist Church, had gathered with a group of voting rights activists outside of Kemp's office. "The governor is signing a bill that affects all Georgians," said Tamara Stevens, a former Republican who had joined the daily protests against the bill at the Capitol for nearly a month. "Why is he doing it in private? Why is he trying to keep elected officials who are representing us out of the process?" When Cannon knocked on the governor's door demanding to see the signing, 2 white Georgia State Patrol troopers told her, "You're under arrest." They grabbed her arms, put her in handcuffs, and forcefully dragged her from the State House. "Why am I under arrest?" she pleaded with the officers. "There is no reason for me to be arrested. I am a legislator. Do not touch me." She was taken to Fulton County Jail and charged with 2 felonies in a scene that recalled the brutal crackdowns against civil rights activists during the Jim Crow era. Warnock, whose candidate's pastor, visited the jail close to 11 p.m. as a crowd of supporters chanted, "Let her go." "What we have witnessed today," he told reporters, "is a desperate attempt to lock out and squeeze the people out of their own democracy." As Cannon was detained, Kemp signed the bill alongside 6 white male Republican lawmakers under a painting of a slave plantation. "If you don't like being called a racist or Jim Crow, then stop acting like one," Democratic State Senator Nikki Merritt told her Republican colleagues. Abram called the law Jim Crow in a suit and tie. Okay, I'm going to skip a couple paragraphs here, but the key part that I wanted to hit on this talks more about heritage action here. So this is the second paragraph on page 200. "What voting rights groups didn't realize at the time was how the most powerful groups in the conservative movement had orchestrated the passage of the bill behind the scenes, using it as a template to rewrite voting laws nationwide. Anderson told donors that Heritage Action had crafted key parts of the Georgia law and were doing the same with similar bills for Republican state legislatures across the country. In some cases, we actually draft them for them," she said at a Ritz-Carlton perched in the hills of the Sonora Desert. "Or we have a sentinel on our behalf give them the model legislation so that it has grassroots from the bottom up type of vibe." Yeah. Yeah. Sounds great, right? The Georgia law had 8 key provisions that Heritage recommended, Anderson said, including policies severely restricting mail ballot drop boxes, preventing election officials from sending absentee ballot forms to voters, making it easier for partisan workers to monitor the polls, prevent the collection of mail ballots, and restricting the ability of counties to accept donations from nonprofit groups seeking to aid in election administration. All of these recommendations came straight from Heritage's list of best practices drafted that February. With Heritage's help, Anderson said, Georgia became a model for the rest of the country. So going back to like some earlier chapters that we read about laboratories for oligarchy, in Wisconsin, same thing being done here in Georgia after the new American majority had shown up and started to actually make ground in 2020 and so forth.
Can you imagine if, like, the working class had a think tank as well-resourced as something like the Heritage Foundation that drafted progressive legislation templates that they passed out to all the state legislatures and aggressively lobbied them to pass this legislation? Like, wouldn't that be great? And is the DSA already doing that or working on it? I hope so.
I think DSA is probably doing better than the DNC as far as like getting aligned on actual policies that they agree with and whatnot.
Yeah.
But to your point, like this last part here is like, how do they do it, right? To create this echo chamber, this is the end of page 201. To create this echo chamber, as Anderson put it, Heritage was spending $24 million over 2 years in 8 battleground states, Arizona, Michigan, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Nevada, Texas, and Wisconsin, to pass and defend restrictive voting legislation. Every Tuesday, the group led a call with right-wing advocacy groups like the Susan B. Anthony List, Tea Party Patriots, and Freedom Works to coordinate the efforts at the highest levels of the conservative movement. We literally give marching orders for the week ahead, Anderson said. Also, we're singing from the same song sheet of the goals for the week and where the state bills are across the country. Though the bills have been sold as advancing election integrity, they were aimed more at helping GOP candidates take back power. We are going to take the fierce fire that is in every single one of our bellies, Anderson told the donors, to the right the wrongs of November. The forces behind the drive to rewrite the country's voting laws were led by the push to entrench minority rule on multiple fronts, not just redistricting access to the ballot, but transforming the courts, undercutting the census, drawing new gerrymandered maps, reducing the size of the country's non-white population, and reshaping the election systems. Trump's delegitimization of the electoral process gave Republicans a sweeping opening to redefine core democratic institutions and limit who could exercise basic democratic rights. After their success in Wisconsin, they made Georgia the new laboratory for oligarchy. Yeah. So to me, that's just like you were saying, one, it's the money aspect, right? The money and the level of coordination that buys, right? Like if you have $24 million, that can pay a lot of people to do a lot of canvassing and work across, those different countries. So they're those different states. Yeah. So what is the left equivalent? Like, is it, some combination of ACLU, NAACP, and like DSA? I mean, it's not, the thing is, those are specific organizations that have like specific things they do, their goals that might be aligned to, more left ideals, but they're not a leftist political organization that's advancing like a specific view of the country writ large, right? Where this is, they have a very specific view that they want to see.
Yeah, I think the DSA is closest to reaching it because they're organized in most major cities across the country at this point, and they're doing good on the local level. It's just kind of scaling that organization and coordinating between cities. That's kind of, I feel like, the next stage of their growth, but they're doing very well on the city level already, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the money, all they're operating off or whatever the members pay and their dues, and so that's a slow process to build that base, and they depend on so much volunteer labor, volunteer time, and that's the fight we're always up against because these people have so much fucking money to just throw around at everything.
Makes a big difference.
Yeah,
and it's interesting that I think they would call out, they called out the Brookings Institution as like a liberal institute.
Never thought of them as liberal. I think of Brookings and Heritage as both like conservative think tanks in my mind.
So I just think it's interesting. Like there are liberal think tanks, but are there liberal think tanks that are active in the same way that the Heritage Foundation and Heritage Action are? I don't think so. Like I think that's but I don't know for sure. I mean, I don't hear about them, I guess, is the thing.
All this stuff has also taken place against a backdrop of McCarthyism in the 20th century. Like people went to jail for saying they were a socialist or a communist or an anarchist or anything. And so trying to do anything overtly leftist policy-wise, there's the whole Red Scare that we're still trying to I don't know. They're trying to start it up again, and we're trying to grow past it and I don't know, just have honest conversations about how to make lives better for everybody. It's a hard environment to be in.
Yeah, hopefully the ideals, like you said, they work out in places like New York City and can be held as an example of ways that we can improve. Second to last thing I want to hit on for this chapter, I've got just two pieces I'm going to read. First one is coming from page 214. This is right after the break there, so it's the third paragraph down. But I guess the context before going into this was all the work that Warnock had been doing to try and pass additional voting rights legislation. And so what the White House had been prioritizing instead was trying to do their Build Back Better and making sure that it got like Joe Manchin and other people on their side. But anyway, so let me read through this part here. As the White House prioritized preserving the filibuster over passing voting rights legislation, Republicans launched an all-out campaign to kill the For the People Act. Heritage Action led the conservative coalition opposing the bill. H.R. 1 is basically the dream bill of every left-wing advocacy group we've been fighting against for years on election issues, von Spakovsky said at the group's donor event in April. At the beginning of the year, Heritage put out a short summary of the worst provisions of the bill. Now, we all know congressional staffers don't like reading 900-page bills. The fact sheet we put out is being used by congressional staffers, members of Congress, to go up and fight H.R. 1. The group dubbed the bill the Corrupt Politicians Act, a label that was soon being used by leading Republicans like Ted Cruz. We've made sure that every single member of Congress knows just how bad this bill is. Jessica Anderson added, we've made sure there's an echo chamber of support around these senators driven by your Heritage Action activists and sentinels across the country, where we've driven hundreds of thousands of calls, emails, placed letters to the editor, hosted events, and run television and digital ads. The group focused particular attention on Manchin, organizing a rally in West Virginia in March, urging him to stand up for West Virginian values, even as it bussed in conservative activists from states hundreds of miles away. After having a bit of fun with Manchin, Anderson told the donors the group ran ads urging vulnerable Democratic senators to preserve the filibuster and block the bill. Anderson described the fight in existential terms. It's an all-hands-on-deck moment, she said in April. If we don't win this, we lose our republic, period. Again, wanted to highlight this section here just because it's really telling of what their Heritage Action is doing here. If they're basically going directly at senators, I mean, saying digital ad campaigns, I'm assuming running digital ads where they're geolocated, trying to like literally send them an ad directly that they are getting influenced by. So like they're putting a ton of effort into just directly influencing senators from these different states, like by bussing people in. Like it is not a grassroots kind of vibe, thing, despite what they're going for there.
That quote you read from Jessica Anderson at the bottom of 214 just kind of reads like some of our satirical ad copy. Like, just how just open and just on its face, ridiculous and proud it is. Like, we've made sure there's an echo chamber of support around these senators, driven by your Heritage Action activists. It's crazy.
It's literally, yeah, that's a Deceive America PAC campaign ad for sure.
It's always like, it's the framing of it is like such propaganda too. It's always all or nothing. It's like that, the one just from prior that you were reading about, sign this bill now or else you're going to look weak. It's like, I was always taught if somebody says you got to sign it now, the answer is no.
Yeah.
But they just cave instantly.
Yep. Completely.
It's pretty scary though. It's like the institutionalization here. They're trying to like make the coup and the insurrection like blind to every, we're supposed to all be blind to it. Like, will we even know if there is a coup, which I think is kind of one of the big takeaways I got. And it's like they're, trying to like puppeteer the entire democratic system here while, siphoning off all the money and control and creating their little bunkers.
Yep. 100%. And they've got, models to do it. I mean, Orban in Hungary, and like, I think we talked about this, but like Paul Manafort started a lot of that shit and was an early person that did this. But yeah, I'm totally there with you on that. I mean, I guess technically we also have a model in Hungary for how they got rid of Orban, but it took some crazy high turnout, like highest turnout in Hungary history or something for election to actually overcome all the institutional challenges put in place. So I guess that's the bar we've got to set. So the last thing I want to hit on here, I won't read all of this, but I just want to kind of talk about this for a minute. The way that this chapter ends, also not a super uplifting ending for this chapter. I think we're 1 for 9 out of the chapters. They end with a good note or not. But 218, it talks about how like the last paragraph is like Biden maintained passing popular pieces of legislation would prove democracy works and restore the legitimacy of the democratic process. I think that was a bad call on Biden's team's part. I'm not sure. And basically they never even got everything that they wanted because Manchin opposed Biden's Build Back Better. So he did all this for nothing and kind of came out too late on the Voting Rights Act that they were trying to get passed. Or the final name for it was the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. And so the way that the chapter ends, I'm going to read it on page 222. After 12 hours of debate, the proposal to change the Senate rules to pass the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act narrowly failed at 10:30 p.m. Sinema, that's Kristen Sinema, they talk about her in here for a little bit, but she stood up and loudly shouted I to oppose it. The first person to congratulate her was Louisiana Senator John Kennedy, one of 6 Republicans who had objected to counting the Electoral College votes in her home state on January 6. The vote underscored how unrepresentative of the country the Senate had become. The 48 Democrats who supported reforming the filibuster represented 34 million more Americans than the 52 senators who upheld it. Manchin and Sinema collectively represented 2.8% of the U.S. population, but had killed the Democrats' last best chance to protect and expand voting rights for tens of millions of Americans. Our failure to pass voting rights in this moment, when the democracy itself is under assault, is not only a public policy failure, in my view, it's a moral failure, Warnock said. He was proud that he'd convinced every Democrat to support the voting rights bill, but admitted we could not get every single member to see that the urgency of this moment required us to not allow any Senate rule to usurp and supplant people's fundamental right to vote. He argued that those who blocked voting legislation would find themselves on the wrong side of history. I think when the history of this period is written, our children, our grandchildren will ask, "What were you doing when our house of democracy was on fire?" he said. "What were you doing when we witnessed the most violent assault on the United States Capitol we've seen since the War of 1812? What were you doing when that cancer metastasized into voter suppression bills and laws all across the states, all across the country? All of us need to stand up and be counted at this moment." The juxtaposition between his victory in Georgia and the insurrection the next day would always be personal for Warnock. "We're caught somewhere between January 5th and January 6th, he said that evening. "In this push and pull, the insurrectionists are winning." So I don't know where we go from there, but I think it's to chapter 10 through the end here. I guess the thing is, like, Ari is continuing to show us, points of progress, and then how those points of progress have been blocked or removed by institutions and those that are in charge as they kind of feel their power either slipping away or their ability to maintain power slipping away. I mean, that's where I'm sitting right now, 9 chapters into the book. Or how you guys feel, but that's where I'm at.
Yeah, definitely. I think showing the coups and the silent movements, it's really interesting to see, like, kind of what's going on behind the scenes from the GOP side, not a lot from the DNC side. And I don't know, it's pretty inspiring that he's still tracking it, and we're still, like, looking at what they're doing and their means, and we're keeping an eye on it. That's, I think, really great. But yeah, like, where does it go and how to fight back and who is fighting back?
I think that was the intent of the book, since it was before the second election of
Fight back? Really doing it.
It was like, hey, you guys really shouldn't vote for this guy again. Here's all the reasons why.
Yeah.
It didn't work out so well. Or here's the reasons why you should vote for him if you're a white supremacist that wants control of the country.
Better voting methods from, like, the dawn of everything. So many civilizations had so much better representation, voting ways in, like, council meetings and meeting gatherings and, like, lottery systems. And hey, you're not from America. What if we got the top socialist from the Netherlands to come rule us for 4 years? Like, there's so many different things that you could do, but this is just like suppress the vote and have them, very small minority class rule. It's really gross.
Yeah. Well said. Just thinking about what you were saying, Cody, about him trying to warn everybody before the second election and everything. And, like, it's always kind of the trap we fall into with, like, justifiably, like, wanting to critique right-wing fascists and these kind of nasty politics that just suppress rights and abuse people. The critique's not enough. Like, the critique is one thing. You have to give an alternative vision that's compelling and interesting and engaging. Like, it doesn't work to just point out that Republicans are hypocrites who are self-serving and yada, 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 because it doesn't offer an alternative view. And it's that alternative vision that we're seeing people more and more motivated by in campaigns like Mondani, even the policies behind Graham Plattner's campaign and all these other DSA victories that are popping up. People are excited about the vision. They don't really care about the person. It's the vision that's exciting them, and that's what we got to focus on.
It's a great way to end it. So we will see you all, or you will hear us, maybe. I don't know. If you come back, we'll put out another episode about 2 weeks. We'll have another core episode coming out, and then we will close out our book discussion on Minority Rule. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone you think would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow, and the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time,
Stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
Propaganda loves you.